the east, the Indus Valley. The region was populated with the Karians, and we know a bit about the Karians. They had their own culture, they had their own scripts and language. Unfortunately, we don't know much about the early period of Karia except for outside of Karia. So it seems that the Karians used to write, but not to write on marble or not to write on stones, except when they were away from home, meaning that more than 80% of the epigraphic material written in Karian is originating from Egypt, because the Karians were used as mercenaries in Egypt for many years. So we hear a lot about Karia. We start hearing a lot about Karia in the classical period, especially in the 6th century. And in the late 6th century, the Karians participated in the Union Revolt against the Persian authority. They were dominated by the Persians, and at that time they belonged to a general satrapy, including Ionia, Lydia, Caria, and also Lycia. They were very brave, and even when Ionia fell down, the Karians were the last standing against the Persian authority. Anyhow, eventually they lost the battle and reintegrated the Persian kingdom. Then the next time we hear about Karia is in the late 5th, early 4th century BC, when the great king decided to completely reorganize the western facade of Asia Minor, and then to cut down this huge satrapy, which was controlled from Lydia and Sardis, into small, autonomous, independent satrapies. We don't know much about the case of Lycia, but Caria, Lydia, and Ionia became 3 independent satrapies. During this event, there was a unique, very interesting position taken by the great king of Persia, because usually when he was creating a satrapy, he would send one of his own, one of his kin or one of his commander with troops in order to control at least the capital of the satrapy. In the case of Caria, he chose not to send one of his close administrator, but instead he chose a local dynasty, Ekatomnos, to become the Persian satrap of Caria. And that would create a situation which is particularly interesting in how a local Anatolian-rooted dynasty appointed satrap by the Persian king would react in his own region, and how would he use this power in his own region. So what we know about the Ekatomnids, and you would see that among those there is this famous mausoleum, the builder of the mausoleum, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Well, they've been very active, although they didn't reign for a long time. You see, I mean, in the late 4th century, around 330, it was finished after the conquest of Alexander. But they did a great job, because their work was to unify Caria, which was, in fact, a series of small principalities dominated by small dynasts. And what they did in order to unify this country is that they built a lot of, or they founded or refounded a lot of cities, and they tried to establish a common cultural background for Caria. They established their first capital in the birthplace of the Ekatomnid family, which seems logical, which is the modern town of Milas, ancient Milasa. And as you see, northeast of Milasa, there is this small shrine of Labraunda. Labraunda was a very small shrine at that time, but it became a pan-Carian sanctuary, extra-urban sanctuary, and it became central into the policy of the Ekatomnid. It was so central that from Ekatomnos to Mausolos to Idrius to Pixodaros, they represented Zeus Labraundus from Labraunda on their own coins. Labraunda is known from literary sources, several literary sources mentioning the shrine, starting with Herodotus down to Aelian. Those provide very valuable information. In fact, it was so famous and so unusual that very early on, according to Anatolian archaeology, excavation started here under the direction of Axel Persson, Swedish researcher. His aim was to break the roots, to try to find out, to trace the roots of these double axe sanctuaries. We know the double axe. He used to work a lot in Crete, he used to work a lot in Egypt and in the early shrines, and he thought that one of the possible answer that would be could be found in Labraunda, as it was the only well-established known sanctuary of the double axe. So before that, I must put this slide because the first one to document the site was a French scholar, Philippe Lebas, which spent quite a lot of time right here at the French school in Athens. So when Philippe Lebas arrived in the early 30s, although he only started in 48, you can see that the shrine was quite lost completely in the vegetation, but he very quickly started very large excavations, and one can say that he was a bit disappointed because although he uncovered a very large and very rich in terms of architecture sanctuary, he never found the roots of this sanctuary. It's a pity because he died very early in 1951, and for years and years, and 60 and 65 years, people have been trying to find the roots of this sanctuary. We were always convinced that the sanctuary of Labraunda was rooted in the Anatolian, even earlier than Hittite Anatolian history. We always believed that the sanctuary was starting from this rock cut. Lars Carlson, Professor Lars Carlson, who's been the director at Labraunda for many years, always explains it as, you know, this split rock, which is very famous. People, the locals, tell us that every time there is a storm, the thunder is hitting this split rock. This is physically understandable, as below the rock there is a very rich source of fresh water. So the thunder hits the rock, and this is seen from the plain of Mylassa. So we always believed that people would see the thunder falling on the same place, in the mountains, and then they would say, okay, the god is showing the place, the god is showing the place, and it's always the same place. So they would go through the mountains, come here, and then they would discover this huge rock split in half. It is so neat that it is as if it is cut with an axe. And so only the god with the double axe could do this and show his power. So we always believed that everything started here, and by pure chance, while making some cleaning at the foot of this rock right here, where there is, we believe, a small shrine dedicated to Kybele, we discovered traces of very early occupation from the early Bronze Age, the very, very early Bronze Age. So it seems that now we've got confirmation that, in fact, the sanctuary that we believe to belong to Kybele was, in fact, the origin of the sanctuary here. Unfortunately, we've got a huge gap between this very early occupation and then the classical time. We don't have anything in between. In the late 6th century BC, the sanctuary was limited to this one small terrace. Well, it's not very much seen here, unfortunately, but the rock is there. So just below the rock, there was this very little terrace wall supporting Dystyle in Antis temple and a small propylon. And that's all we know from the early periods of Labraunda. But in a couple of decades, Mausolus and his brother Idrius will completely change the shape of the sanctuary. All the known, for sure, hecatomnid construction are here in green, and one should add also the monumental tomb there. So, as you can see, it was a complete transformation. How do we know that those were the work of Mausolus and Idrius? This is really precise in date. Well, we've been very lucky. I mean, the archaeologists working there have been very lucky, as most of them carry inscriptions. This inscription belonged to what is called the North Stoa, located right there, which is now disappeared as it has been rebuilt in the Roman period. The Romans were nice enough to preserve the dedication of Mausolus. Then, following the North Stoa, the hecatomnids, and probably it was started by Mausolus, decided to enlarge the building. It was nonetheless signed by his brother Idrius. They, in fact, preserved the Dystyle in Antis early temple, which has this very interesting, almost square shape, and then they added a peripteron all around, doubling the superficie of the site. We've got here again an inscription that confirmed the fact that Idrius was the one to sign the building, although probably the work was started with Mausolus. So this is a view of the reconstructed temple of Labraunda. This is quite impressive, but that's not the only impressive building. Behind, west of the temple, we found those two little rooms fronted by a colonnaded tetrastyle in Antis. Here again, so here is a plan of the building, quite an unusual shape. And here again, we've been lucky as we've got the complete inscription showing that Idrius, son of Hecatomnos from Mylassa, dedicated those oikoi to Zeus Labraundos. So one might wonder what are those oikoi and what were they used for. At the very beginning, people started saying, okay, man, this is probably the house for the priest, the high priest of Labraunda, but it seems a bit little. So we start thinking that it was in fact kind of a treasury of the sanctuary. I want to emphasize the unusual entablature of this building. As you can see, it has a Doric order, colonnade, architrave, but the frieze is completely missing. This is not a mistake of the architect who drew this picture. It is the reflect of reality, archaeological reality. So I've been too quick. If I can find my mark, yeah. So if we jump, we'll come back to the central part here later. If we jump down the hill, we see that those are probably the most Greek buildings of the sanctuary built by the Hecatomnids, starting with the south propylon, which is a monumental gate with 3 main doors, and Dystyle in Antis on both sides, on the south side and the north side. It was a very impressive elevation as reconstructed here. And here again, we've got, unfortunately, not all of the inscription, but a large part of this inscription. This was one of the very important buildings together with the East Propylon, as those were just like the temple, but not unlike all the other buildings, they were entirely built out of marble. And that's why so little is left, unfortunately. Unlike most of the sanctuaries of the Greek world, and Delphi is one of the examples, we are very lucky because in Labraunda we don't have just one propylon, we've got two. It was so important that we had to have two entrances. So this is the only building that is probably from the Catamnis, although we don't have the dedication from Mausolus or Idrius, but you can see that the plan is absolutely identical with the south propylon. And the architectural details of the building, here above you've got the capitals from the south propylon, clearly dated with the inscription, and details here of the east propylon. Well, this is so close that it might even have been built by the same architect or the same workers. Between those two propylons, as water was one of the key elements in Labraunda, the Catamnis also built this small fountain house called the Doric house. Here again, we've got the very partial inscription, no molasses. This is clearly dating from Idrius because when Mausolus was dedicating his building, he would never sign Milasius. He would always sign Mausolus, son of Hekatomnos, dedicated this building, while Idrius, his brother, would always constantly sign Idrius, son of Mausolus, from Mylassa, dedicated this building. So this is clearly, again, a construction from Idrius. It is quite unusual in shape, and well, we never clearly understood why it was so irregular. The interesting point here is that when the Romans built a huge bath east of the building, they had to build a praephonium above the foundation of the house. So they took down the whole front facade and they recut the architrave, but while doing that, they preserved the inscription of Idrius, which shows how they were interested in emphasizing the continuity of this sanctuary. This is a view of the reconstructed building. As you can see here, once again, the whole architectural members are present. There is another building which I would like to mention. This is called the East Stoa. This was probably a pie-shaped stoa. This is not dedicated. We don't have an inscription. We conducted, Pontus Estrom conducted some investigation on the gneiss stylobate of the building and found all the members of the elevation except for everything above the capitol. And he has this idea that, in fact, the upper part of the elevation might have been built out of wood. Nonetheless, the characteristics of this building, of this East Tower, are very interesting, as it is a series of 6 rooms. It's almost 40 meters long, and you can see that there is each door is slightly off-center. This has been a casse-tête, as we say in French, trying to understand why systematically the building would have a door which is off-center. Well, very simply, and that was found later on, thanks to Thomas Timm, because those are dining rooms. And in order to be able to fit the beds of the dining room, you start on the left with 1 full and 1 width. And if you continue the same model, then you arrive at the end with just 1 full length of the bed. That explains why the door is off-center. This is not dated by inscription, unfortunately, but we've got quite a good amount of material in the foundation of the stylobed that dates it from the period of the Catamnis. So either Mausolus or Idrius. Also, the Catamnis tried to monumentalize the path leading upward toward the temple of Zeus by building, for example, this huge really monumental, really, I'm sorry because I'm keeping repeating this word monumental, but that's really, really impressive. It's almost 20 meters large staircase. This is something that also dates from the Catamnids. I must add, because this is my personal interest, a monumental tomb, which is interestingly located on the very top, above the sanctuary. We still couldn't decide whether, and the archaeological research going on, we still couldn't decide whether this monumental tomb was located inside or outside the temenos. Probably, my thoughts are that probably the south wall of the tomb would be the northern limit of the temenos, but that needs to be confirmed by archaeology. This is a very interesting building. Very impressive, very massive. It is composed of an open court, and it has 2 stories. To give you an idea of the size of the stones, each of those stones are weighing 4 tons, and you've got 10 of them. So the roof of the second story is weighing 40 tons. If you take a look at this block, which paves the floor of the second story, those are much larger. Each of those are 6 tons, and you've got, again, 10 of them. So between the roof and the pavement of the second story, it's already 100 tons of material that were moved in order to build this monumental tomb. The architecture is, although it's done in gneiss, it's absolutely marvelous. The cobalt vault is built out of 4 stones only. The space, as I said, when you enter from the south, you've got this open court. Then you enter the lower story with an antechamber, and then the chamber where 3 very large gneiss sarcophagi are still existing here. But this is only part of the building, as in the slope below the tomb there are many architectural members that can be seen, and as there are no other buildings around, it is believed, and seriously believed, that all members came from the tomb, in fact. And when we decided to document the slope, we can clearly see that all the members fell from the top of the podium. So what you have to imagine is this huge podium topped with another level of elevation, which is basically this, with a blind wall, 3 pillars, and then the Doric entablature. So that would give quite an impressive view of the tomb itself, but even more when you take it from the north tower with the temple here, and you can see the mise en scène of the site. So this tomb was really central into the approach of the sanctuary. Well, if you were a visitor in the 4th century BC, you would see clearly the first toas, the temple, the Andron I'm going to speak about, but then topping everything would be the monumental tomb. The Catamnids also built many structures outside the temenos. I want to mention first a defensive network, including, for example, this very large fortification on the top 100 meters above the tomb, on the top of the hill, protecting the site, protecting the sanctuary, but also there is a series of 5 different fortifications along the road, the sacred road leading from the capital, Mylassa, up to the sanctuary of Zeus, Labraundos. And also, as while developing the architecture of the site, they also developed the activity at the site, at the sanctuary. And they changed, there was a very small festival, they changed it into a 1 full week festival, and in order, and with competitions and so on. So in order to sustain this festival, they built one of the earliest known stadium in Anatolia. This is quite interesting because, as you can see here, this is the bottom of the stadium. It has a straight border. But now we reached the main piece, the most discussed building ever, which is the Andron B and also his brother, the Andron A. Unfortunately, not much is left of the Andron B. As you can see here, his brother, the Andron A, is much better preserved. So it is called Andron A and B because they were found in this order. It's not because the Andron A is earlier than the Andron B. On the contrary, the Andron B, as you can see here, is in fact dedicated by Mausolos, son of Ekatomnos. It was almost entirely built out of gneiss, but the gneiss would be plastered and the facade would then be built completely out of marble with lavish architecture and details that would make this building one of the most important of the sanctuary, if not the most important. When those buildings were found, and before they found the inscription, especially the inscription in the Andron A, it was believed to be small temples, daestalinantes. It is a very classical architecture, although you can see that it has side and front windows, and also there is this very strange addition of a niche on the back wall of the Andron. Here again, it's not clear on the plan, but the door is slightly off-centered. And while taking the model as known in the East Stoa, it is very easy to reconstruct those banquets, meaning that those were monumental banquet halls, ceremonial, where probably the king would receive his ambassadors, the most important visitors to the site. So this is really more than religious, it is a political building. I want also to show you this reconstructed facade and its very peculiar architecture, and that's what has been discussed for so many years. As you can see, it has an Ionic colonnade. The problem is that the Ionic colonnade is supporting Doric entablature. So when this was found and this was reconstructed, people started saying, reacting and saying, okay, in fact, the pieces that you found while digging the building, they were probably brought from another building. The problem is that the same succession and the same pieces working closely together were found in the Andron A, which is much better preserved. So it was built like that. It was clearly built as a structure that would combine the Ionic and the Doric order at Labraunda. For this one, which is the Andron A, we've got the dedication with Andron. This is the plan of the building of the Andron A, the better preserved one. It has side windows, front windows as the previous one, and it has again here the very same niche on the back. The inscription is more fragmentary, but it can be reconstructed as John Krampa did in the 70s, and this building is belonging to Idrius. So this makes a nice sanctuary. This makes a nice Greek-type sanctuary. Propylaea, temple, shrine, fountain house. Although it has some peculiarities in terms of architecture, and that's what started everything in the discussion. A bit of an historiography. Tomlinson in 1963 mentions the hecatomnid barbaric misinterpretation of Greek architectural forms Those were barbarians. They didn't understand anything. And hornblower is sitting on two different positions. I mean, sometimes he qualifies them as proto-Hellenistic kings, but at the same time, they're kind of satraps by some ways. So maybe last of the satraps and first of the diadochi. But in fact, the barbarism of some of the Catamaran architectural details is rightly insisted on. They didn't really understand what they were doing. They did something. It was nice, beautiful, but they missed something. Pontus Herstrom wrote Greek architecture promoted by indigenous Philhellenism. So those were barbarians, but they were trying to reach Greece. They were trying to communicate with Greece, which is not completely wrong. And then Ruzicka in 1992 wrote a book entitled Politics of a Persian Dynasty. So for him, the Khatamids were belonging to the Persian Wars. Also, he says that the Khatamid domination of Karian marks the beginning of the end of Karian history. This is quite severe, as most of the scholars until you see the beginning of the 90s criticized so harshly the Khatamids that the main point was that they tried to achieve something, but they missed it. They tried to be as the Greeks, they couldn't. They tried to be as the Persians, but they couldn't, so they missed it. They failed. In fact, there are indeed, and just to stay in the sanctuary, many non-Greeks feature in this place. The layout of the sanctuary is strange. The building type and iconography is unusual. And also the fact that there is so much glorification of the dynas and the dynasty is not Greek at all. So let's take them one by one. The layout is interesting. Monumental entrances, I should have put an S. Monumental staircase, audience halls, treasury, cult place with probably the small altar, and the monumental tomb. This is not really a Greek sanctuary, this is a Persian palace. If you add the importance of the water, which I didn't insist on, but you've got so much water running everywhere, and the central, if you remember, I said that the core of the sanctuary started around this huge split rock, at the bottom of which you've got this fountain, this spring, and just in Labraunda we've got 4 monumental springs, and along the road from Milassa to Labraunda we've got more than 40 small spring houses. So if you had the fact that there is those springs and spring houses, if you had the fact that Herodotus and Plutarch speak about a holy grove of plane trees as Labraunda, this is not in fact a palace, this is a paradisos. I mean, all interpretations are opened. The building type, I already mentioned it. Those if it goes, yes. So I already mentioned it. Those are nothing else than throne, than audience hall, than apadana in the mentality, in the approach. The king and satrap would sit in the central position, probably together with his wife, and all around there would be a procession of the visitors, of the ambassadors, who would, according to their rank in the hierarchy, would sit slowly around left and right of the dynasty. This is really Persian, as we know from the iconography of, for example, Persepolis. Also, you noticed that the acroteria of this building, and probably also of the Andron, are unusual. Those are very much orientalizing figures that have been found on site inside the Andron during the early excavation. Also, if we come back inside the building and look at this place, the niche, What could have been standing there? Well, there are two possibilities. Either the god itself, protecting the dynast, lying just below him, or the dynasts themselves, it is possible, as one more element of glorification of the dynasty. I would prefer a figure like this, Zeus Labraundos, framed by the dynast and his wife. This is the only representation that we have in a niche that would sit more or less the frame found in the Andron. This stele is from Tegea, and it is clearly written Zeus, Idrius, and Ada. So the god, the main god, with the processing king, is also a feature that is very clearly and so many times repeated in the Persian world, and not much in the Greek in the 4th century. Glorification of the dynasty. This is also a non-Greek feature. Basically, all the main buildings carry the name of the dynasts. Oh, one by one, okay. But that's not all. You've got name on the Doric house, the spring house, South Propylon, Andron B, Andron A, Oikoi, temple, Stoa. The only buildings for which we don't have an inscription are the East Propylon and the East Stoa. And basically those are the two only buildings for which we don't have the entablature. It is lost. Either it was built out of wood or it was built out of marble and then ripped off. The problem is that we don't have those pieces for those two buildings. So we saw that the architecture of the South Propylon and the East Propylon was so close that they must have been built at the same period. And it makes sense. For the East Stoa, the fact that we've got this series of dining rooms recalls clearly the Andron and also the material found, so precise the days. So there might have been as well inscriptions on those. So this is repeating and repeating. The inscriptions, that's one point. The buildings, this is interesting. Why would we have two Andrones? I mean, one ceremonial hall would be enough for the dynasty. This is the hall of the dynasty. If we take a look at, and again I'm going to refer to Persepolis, we've got different thrones, throne halls. Xerxes got his own, and Darius has got his own. So the king has to emphasize his power, his authority, by building this throne hall, this banqueting hall, this ceremonial hall, emphasizing his importance. So, what can we do with all of those? They're not Greek, clearly, they're not Greek. But they clearly want to be Greek, or they show some Greekness, or they show some Philhellenism. But then why do they keep this Persian or non-Greek pattern and iconography? So they wanted to be Persian, or they had to be Persian because they had to refer to the great king, so they had to show their attachment to the Persian world and to the Persian authority, although I believe that it didn't, I mean, it was not so important. My interpretation is that they built a narration. They built a narration of identity, of authority, of monumentality. They built a narration of culture, of material culture, which is Karian. It is not Greek, it is not Persian, this is Karian. We're powerful because we've got the Persian authority backing us up, and we know how to build. We're using, they used the vocabulary that was at hand. The vocabulary of power in this part of the world was the Persian iconography. The architectural monumental vocabulary was the Greek vocabulary. So what they did, basically, they represented the Persian power using Greek vocabulary, architectural vocabulary. So they didn't try to do this or that. They just said, you might think this is Persian, it's not. You might say or think this is Greek, it's not. This is Karian. This is what we are. We're none of them, but we're powerful enough to integrate both of them. And I think that this was the narration that they tried to put together. And they succeeded. They succeeded because when we started digging these recent years inside the terminals again, when we started coming back inside the terminals for the excavations, what we realized is that although the Catamnists disappeared, or their power disappeared early in the late 4th century, like 320s, the late 4th century and the early 3rd century continues experiencing monumentality, monumental constructions in Labraunda in the shape of the Catamnists. And down to the Roman period, even the Romans, they would build a third Andron based on the model of the Andron A and the Andron B. They would shape their terrace walls, the new terrace walls, as header and stretchers, as the Catamnists did. In order to keep this continuity, they would rebuild the North Tower, saving and keeping and showing the inscriptions of dedication of mausoleums in one of the entire walls. So this narration that this narration of local power and local identity worked. Although it was established in like 3 decades, it worked for for so many centuries. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation très vivante et très énergique du site, et puis cette thèse sur l'utilisation du site et la reprise de l'architecture grecque et sa transformation. C'est vraiment très intéressant. Ça rappelle évidemment dans le monde karien d'autres monuments, d'autres cas. Ça s'inscrit de manière très cohérente dans le contexte général. C'est vraiment très frappant. Je pense qu'il y aura des questions. Is there any question about this very energetic presentation? And question in French or in English or in Greek? I will make the translation, or in Turkish if you want, of course. Oui, Maud.
Regarding the tomb, perhaps you mentioned it, but is it a Persian type? Is it very local, the architecture of the tomb? Could you say more about that?
I'd be very happy to say more about that. The tomb, we started working on it a couple of years ago. Strangely, nobody ever worked on the tomb up to now, although it was one of the most obvious buildings. Even before the excavation started, only 2 buildings were seen, the Andron A, the big one, almost 10 meters high, and the tomb. And it was, I don't know why, always considered as far away or not interesting enough. So we only start putting together pieces concerning this tomb. So concerning the type of the tomb, if you look at the shape as I gave it at the very end, including the podium sheltering the funerary space, topped by, let's say, a second story topped by a superstructure, this is a mausoleum type of tomb. This is a mausoleum, copied or originated from the mausoleum type. So the question, and the key question, is the date of the tomb. We've been carrying a cleaning, very detailed cleaning inside the tomb, hoping to find some material. We didn't find any piece of material in the tomb. It was open for many years. But as we know, and experienced archaeologists know it, even when it's robbed and robbed for centuries, there is always something staying behind. And we couldn't find anything, unfortunately. So we started working around. And just below the tomb, I didn't show it there because it's a long presentation. I mean, that would take more hours. But there is a structure associated to the tomb, which is a pie-shaped building like a monumental altar with a banquet, and we've got levels of ashes and stuff like that that we just found last year. So there was an altar associated to the tomb. And the date of this altar, which is a reuse phase, is late 4th century. And I also believe that the tomb was built in 2 different phases. First, the podium, with probably a small entablature, and then the entablature was gone and replaced by this huge superstructure that I just showed. And this superstructure dates from, let's say, the late 4th, early 3rd century BC. So the podium might be earlier than this. So it is clearly either Hecatomnid or pre-Hecatomnid. If it's pre-Hecatomnid, it's not very early. I mean, let's say late 5th century, not 6th century, I don't think. But this is, it's a long answer to answer your question. But the chronology is the key point. If it's late 4th century, it is an avatar of the mausoleum. If it's late 5th century, it is the origin of the mausoleum. So that answers somehow your question.
Yes.
I might ask 2 questions if I can. The first one is the Persian influence that you see here. Why do you think it matters in a sanctuary that is clearly Karian? Why do they need to put Persian influence in here when the Persian movement and Persian interest in Anatolia is largely unfocused, I think, upon religion? And then my other question is the knowledge of Persian layout. You point to Persepolis and audience halls and having tombs above the city and so forth. Do you think the knowledge of how Persians organize their space that you see mapped onto this sanctuary is coming from the heartland of Persia itself, or is it coming from Persians living in Anatolia in terms of an Anatolian-mediated knowledge of Persian space?
First question. Why did they need to emphasize this Persian connection? When the Hecatomnids were appointed by the Persians satrap of Karian, it didn't go smoothly. We know at least 2 attempts of killing on mausoleums. I mean, you have to think that Karian was a mosaic of small principalities, villages that would even start minting coins early in the 6th century. So they were keen on their authority, those dynasts. And when it's like a family. When one is picked up to get all the heritage and the money, well, the other starts shouting. And so what I think is that they had to refer, because this is the justification of their power. This is also to say, we've got a backup. This brings us power and money and authority. And that's why I think they used this, because this was the most obvious image of authority. That was the Persian iconography. Now, how did they connect with the Persian in terms of planning of the sanctuary? This is a really good question. We've always been trying to understand why the great king of Persia would appoint Hecatomnos as satrap. So, meaning that we've always trying to understand, we've always been trying to understand what were the connections between Hecatomnos and the great king of Persia. Knowing also that right after Hecatomnos was appointed satrap, the great king asked him to repress a revolt in Cyprus, of the kings of Cyprus. It was so confident, I mean, the great king was so confident into Hecatomnos that he would not only appoint him satrap, but put him at the head of the whole navy in order to go fight some other locals. So that poses the question of their connection. And we don't know. So what we know is that in terms of planning and paradisos and palaces, there are some known in Western Asia Minor. There was a Paradeisos very close to Labraunda, although we don't really know where it is, but it's around the Meander or the Marsyas Valley. But it is also very possible that Ekatomnos or his family was somehow connected to central Persia and visited there very often. We know, for example, that the satraps that were sent away, the great king would keep their sons and daughters to educate them before sending them to the satrapy. It is also possible that, for example, Mausolos or even Idris were sent to Persepolis and educated there. We don't know. They had Paradeisos, they had palaces around in Western Asia Minor that they could refer to, that they could visit as satraps. But we don't know the real connection. Also, the fact is that we know from a recent, very interesting PhD, the key element of the Paradeisas, which is basically the sanctuary, the house, the entrance, the water, and the forest. So this is the 5 key elements that we have in Labraunda. And the tomb, I forgot the tomb. But at the same time, we never could find any Paradeisos in Western Asia Minor, although we know that they must have existed. And same, I mean, the palace is not very hard to find. Speak with Candilan in Daskilion, he's pulling his hair out, so he doesn't have much left. So well, I'm sorry, it's a non-answer to your question. It's because we don't really know.
Thank you. May I ask you about a sanctuary that's very, very nearby, and that's Euramos, and whether you can bring this into alignment with what's going on here?
Euramos is a very interesting city because it is one of the few cities with more than one Karian inscription. So it shows the ancientness of the site. The problem is that Euramos has never been dug out, unfortunately. And it's only since, well, really last year that excavation started there. So a member of the Labraunda team, Baptiste Vergniaud, who did his PhD on fortification in Western Asia Minor, and who is working on the fortification on the Acropolis of Labraunda, will be working with the Euramos team to work on the fortification and try to trace down the Catomnid remains of this city. Unfortunately, what is known for now is that it's a large city. They've got very early Bronze Age necropolis, few tombs that they found last year, and then you jump to the Middle Hellenistic period, unfortunately. In between, we've got those Karian inscriptions, which we cannot date anyhow, but we believe that they must have been carved between the 6th and the 3rd century BC.
Have you seen the terracottas that are in the...
yeah, of course, and there are, yeah, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned the terracottas which were dug out in the 60s. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is a work which is conducted by Suata Teshlia and is showing that there is a unity in the 6th century, 7th, 6th century of the production of those architectural terracottas. But the problem is that the date of those terracottas do not really fit the date of Labraunda. They are earlier. We believe that they are earlier than Labraunda. So we've got elements of occupation, but for now, and I mean, it's due to the lack of research, especially in Euramos, but it's starting now, so hopefully it will grow. But for now, we cannot put the links together.
It's interesting, isn't it, that you've got a very, very Greek city so close, and at the time when Mausolus moves the capital down to Halicarnassus, he's simultaneously in the interior building up a site that really emphasizes a sort of non-Greek, non-Persian, something different Karian identity. He seems to anticipate the Diadokoi and playing to different audiences.
Yeah, but look, Mylassa was not a Greek city.
Yeah.
It never had fortifications, for example.
Right.
So he always played on this ambiguity, I believe.
Yeah. It's also very Macedonian, it seems to me. I mean, these are like palaces if you're going to have audience hall plus banqueting space. And again, that's a place that's on the edge of the Greek world that is free to borrow forms but to reuse them in different ways.
But that's why, I mean, that's the problem of some scholars reading it backwards, saying, for example, they were the proto-Hellenistic kings. Well, you cannot read what's before, I mean, in the light of what happened after, reverse it. I mean, the way they presented their narration, I mean, fitted the ideology of the Hellenistic kings, but it's not proto-Hellenistic kings, I believe. It's not so simple. But we still don't know whether Euromos was a city at the time of Hekatomnos. I mean, that's also the point.
Oui. Merci. Et à la suite de votre communication si intéressante, j'avais plusieurs questions à vous poser. Et surtout à propos de ce qu'on dit le grand 4e siècle de Kari et de sa maison royale. Est-ce que le rayonnement politique et culturel de Kari, tel que vous nous l'avez présenté, c'est-à-dire Hécatomnide et Zeus Labraundeuse, s'étend sur toute la Carie et spécialement sur les villes, sur les cités et cités entre guillemets côtières, c'est-à-dire de l'Égée méridionale et surtout et encore sur les îles en face qui, on nous dit et on prétend, à mon avis, qui étaient soumises aux
Hécatomnides. C'est une très très bonne question. Can I answer in English?
Non, en français, s'il vous plaît. Okay. Enfin.
Okay.
Ce sont des questions que je me suis posées depuis quelques dizaines d'années. Et je n'ai pas trouvé de réponses sur le grand livre de Hornblower, qui est plein de vide, de vacate, comme nous disons les épigraphistes.
Vous êtes un peu sévère.
Ah si, je suis.
Vous êtes sévère.
Oui, on dit.
On doit avoir raison. Parce que le livre de Hornblower était quand même... Bon, enfin, on ne va pas défendre le livre de Hornblower, mais c'est quand même le premier qui a mis tout ça ensemble d'une manière relativement cohérente, même si, à mon avis, aussi, c'est beaucoup trompé. Le livre de Hornblower est écrit dans les années 80. Dans les années 80, il faut voir ce qu'est l'archéologie et les sources archéologiques qu'on a en Carie. C'est extrêmement faible, c'est rien du tout. Maintenant, pour répondre... enfin, c'est pas rien du tout, mais par rapport à ce qu'on connaît aujourd'hui, il y a une grande différence. Maintenant, pour répondre à votre question, la domination des îles particulièrement, c'est une question qui est tout à fait intéressante, mais à laquelle on ne peut pas répondre. Pourquoi ? Parce qu'on n'a aucun élément archéologique pour le dire, à mon sens. On a des occupations, on a du matériel qui date de la même période, mais on ne peut pas dire que les Hécatomnides dominaient l'ensemble des mers, des îles de la mer Égée.
Matériel d'où ? Des îles ?
Oui, on a des prospections où on voit qu'il y a du matériel qui date de la période hécatomnide, mais qui ne veut pas dire qu'il y avait une présence hécatomnide.
Quel matériel ? Et de quelle île ? Et de quelle île ? De l'époque des Hécatomnides et d'influence carienne ?
Pas d'influence. On ne connaît pas la poterie carienne.
Et il y a aussi l'architecture.
Oui,
il y a des tombes. Et puis, pour nous les épigraphistes, il y a les institutions et puis l'anthroponymie. Il y a des traces. Il
y a des traces d'occupation. Allez-y, si on se coupe
Non.
mutuellement, on ne va jamais y arriver.
À mon avis, Hornblower est quelqu'un de très estimé et une expression peut-être adexia de ma part, mais il a négligé de nous présenter l'existence ou la non-existence de témoignages, car si la non-existence de témoignages, ça serait aussi fort intéressant.
Oui, mais
il n'a pas fait, il s'est occupé, c'est un livre unilatéral, il s'est occupé de la carrière qu'il connaît parfaitement, mais pas de l'autre côté.
Mais en archéologie, l'absence de témoignage n'est pas preuve d'absence. C'est pas parce qu'il n'y a pas d'inscription hécatomnide que les hécatomnides n'ont jamais été là. Je veux dire, il faut aussi être très prudent. Maintenant, si on laisse les îles de côté, qui sont un dossier compliqué, concernant les côtes, vous êtes épigraphiste, donc vous devez connaître par exemple les dernières découvertes à Iassos, ville grecque, Karian, où on a ce mausoleum qui est mentionné, mais où on a surtout découvert très très récemment, 5 ou 6 ans, un hôtel dédié aux hécatomnides. Donc on pense, mais encore une fois, faut-il le prouver, on pense qu'à partir de la paix du roi, les hécatomnides, que jusqu'à la paix du roi, ça devait être très compliqué d'atteindre la côte égéenne. Mais qu'à partir de la paix du roi, en 386...
de la paix?
La paix du roi, de King's Peace. La paix.
Ah, la paix du roi.
Voilà.
Ah.
Voilà, qui permettait de réintégrer en fait les cités grecques d'Asie mineure dans le Saint-Perse. On pense que du coup les hécatomnides ont pu s'étendre. Et c'est probablement aussi dans ce mouvement que Mausolos a décidé de déplacer sa capitale de Mylassar vers Halikarnasse. Donc les hécatomnides, alors le problème c'est qu'on ne sait pas jusqu'où ils allaient au nord. Certains ont parlé de Prienne. C'est un peu difficile, à mon avis, dans l'état de nos connaissances. Mais le problème est que on assiste aujourd'hui à... On a mis... Tous les travaux qui ont été menés en Carie ont montré ce que les Cariens ont fait, ce que les hécatomnides ont fait au IVe siècle. C'est-à-dire une urbanisation forcée, une urbanisation très très lourde, avec des techniques de construction. Ils introduisent par exemple le carreau-boutisme dans les fortifications, etc. Et du coup, on assiste en ce moment à un travers qui est de dater de manière, à mon avis, relativement abusive, un certain nombre de vestiges architecturaux sur un style qui est appelé hécatomnide, parce qu'il a été introduit par les hécatomnides, mais dont on sait qu'il a continué à être développé bien après les hécatomnides.
Et à part Iassos, dont le dossier est bien connu, il y a aussi la Perret. Il y a aussi ce qu'on dit la haute Carie. Il y a donc un espace assez développé de cette région. Avez-vous, il y a des traces, excusez-moi, des traces de l'hégémonie des hécatomnides ou du culte de Zeus Labraundeus. Est-ce que vous connaissez s'il y a des traces?
Le problème des frontières de la Carie est un problème très très intéressant, très important.
Non, je n'entends pas ça. J'entends la présence et les vestiges, si vous voulez, les signes du pouvoir hécatomnide dans cette vaste région qui est la Perret, ce qu'on dit la Perret,
C'est-à-dire la Pérée.
La Pérée hérodienne.
Oui, mais la Pérée hérodienne, elle est post-hécatomnide. Je veux dire, la Pérée hérodienne, c'est la Carie principalement.
Mais qui est-ce qui laissait ça?
La Pérée hérodienne, c'est toute cette langue de terre qui est formée aux trois quarts par la Carie hécatomnide.
Oui. Et la haute Carie, non, pas du tout.
Alors, la haute Carie...
La Pérée hérodienne est une vaste, une ligne côtière
qui pénétrait très profond dans la Carie. Stratonicée fait partie de la Pérée hérodienne.
Pas du tout. Pas du tout. C'est pour quelques années. Et à la suite d'Apamée. Et justement, ce qu'il serait intéressant de voir s'il y a, moi je vous dirais non, qu'il n'y a pas de traces, mais j'essaie de voir, j'essaie d'avoir une question de vous qui connaissez très bien la région, n'est-ce pas, et le site, s'il y a des nouveautés de la présence des hécatomnides et du culte de Zeus Labrandeus sur cette région qu'on appelle la Pérée hérodienne, plus la haute Carie, qui est la Carie sujette. Stratonicée faisait partie de la Carie sujette pour un certain temps. Et, car, d'après ce que j'ai compris de l'anglais, et le culte de Zeus s'insère dans la question assez intéressante et récemment débattue, culte royal et culte d'État. N'est-ce pas? On a même un livre très récemment. C'est le culte de la famille royale, du génos des hécatomnides, qui est devenu
un culte pancarien.
Pancarien, justement.
Tout à fait. Alors, encore une fois, quelles pourraient être les traces d'un culte de Zeus Labrandeus en dehors de Labraunda?
De Labraunda? Dédicace.
Laissez-moi finir au moins quelques phrases. Je pense... Comment dire ça? À Labraunda, on a une trace du culte de Zeus Labrandeus, d'abord parce qu'on a des inscriptions. Le problème, c'est qu'ailleurs, il est très difficile de trouver des inscriptions qui mentionnent le culte de Zeus Labrandeus. Maintenant, trouver des inscriptions qui mentionnent le culte de Zeus Labrandeus, comme on en trouve par exemple en Égypte, ne prouve pas que l'Égypte était sous domination carienne. Maintenant, autre chose qui est liée au culte de Zeus Labrandeus, dans la symbolique, qui est la double H. Je crois que cette symbolique dépasse le culte de Zeus Labrandeus. Donc, même si on pourrait dire, on trouve un autel qui porte une double H, donc il devait y avoir un culte de Zeus Labrandeus, je crois que les deux choses ne sont pas du tout systématiques. Donc, la question est, vous parlez, votre question porte sur l'étendue de la domination hécatomnide dans la région. On est d'accord. Mais je ne pense pas qu'on puisse y répondre sans avoir des inscriptions extrêmement claires, comme par exemple la trilingue de Xanthos, qui nous indique que les hécatomnides hydrieux, en l'occurrence, étaient là et avaient la main mise sur la région, etc. Puisque même si on trouve de la céramique carienne, même si on arrive à créer ce qu'on essaie de faire en ce moment, créer une typologie de céramique locale carienne, même si on trouve de la céramique carienne sur un site, ou même si on trouve des traces d'un culte lié à Zeus Labrandeus sur ce site, ça ne veut pas dire que le site était sous domination hécatomnide. Donc il nous faudrait des textes relativement longs, et même, encore une fois, les vestiges architecturaux, on pourrait éventuellement les dater de la période hécatomnide, mais on ne peut pas les attribuer aux hécatomnides. Donc, et sans source littéraire, c'est aussi très très compliqué. Donc je pense que c'est une question à laquelle on ne pourra jamais répondre, à moins d'avoir une inscription très claire qui nous dise ici un marché mausolée, ou alors la population de blabla payait le tribut à Mosul. Et je pense que sans ça, ce sera très difficile de répondre de manière très précise à votre question. Je prends pour preuve la vallée de l'Arpassos, qui est une vallée, une des vallées qui descend du Méandre. Hein. Vous avez la vallée du Marsyas avec Labraunda, le site d'Labraunda, et ensuite vous avez la vallée de l'Arpassos. Et la vallée qui se trouve juste après la vallée de l'Arpassos, c'est la vallée du Lycos avec Aphrodisias, etc. Oui. Jusqu'à très récemment, on pensait que la domination hécatomnide s'étendait intégrait la Haute-Carie, donc, et prenait jusque, on va dire, les sites de Hilarima et la vallée de l'Arpassos. Le problème, c'est que des recherches qui ont été menées récemment et auxquelles j'ai participé ont montré que très probablement, en termes de culture matérielle, on n'est pas en Carie hécatomnide. On est en Carie, mais on n'est pas en Carie hécatomnide. Mais ça se joue sur un laps de temps qui est très court. Le problème des frontières, c'est qu'elles sont constamment fluctuantes. Et c'est très difficile de faire une distinction, enfin, il est très important de faire une distinction, mais c'est très difficile de marquer sur la carte la distinction entre la frontière politique et la frontière culturelle. Puisqu'on a des zones tampons qui sont extrêmement larges, et on peut avoir un temps, une zone culturelle carienne qui appartient à la Carie hécatomnide, mais pour un laps de temps qui est peut-être très court. Et d'autre part, des zones culturelles anciennes cariennes qui n'ont jamais appartenu à la Carie hécatomnide, à la Carie politique hécatomnide. Et je pense que toute la difficulté est là. On peut voir, encore une fois, en travaillant un peu plus, en travaillant un peu mieux, on peut voir l'étendue de la zone d'influence culturelle carienne, mais décider d'une limite de la domination politique des hécatomnides est, à mon avis, sur cette base, est à mon avis très dangereuse.
Merci.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? On va faire un tour très large. Oui, Sylvain Perrault.
What is the status of the Greek language in this confrontation between Greek and Persian cultures?
The Greek took over completely in the 4th century. I shortly mentioned the Karian. And I shortly mentioned the trilingual from Xanthos, where you've got Lycian, Aramean, basically administrative Persian, and Greek. In Korea itself, they write in Greek. It completely took over. On the coins, on the early coins, 6th, 5th century, we've got Karian scripts, Karian letters. Scholars up to recently thought that in the 4th century marked a switch, a very neat switch between the Karian and the Karian language and the Greek language. Well, it is now believed that in fact the Karian language continued, but the official language was Greek. It is the language. It is the administrative language. As far as we know. It seems that the Karians started engraving on marble in Greek. It seems that their will to pérenniser.
Faut essayer.
The official decisions was concomitant with the Greek. When they started writing on a material that would last for centuries, they did it in Greek. Very, very little in Karian. We've got this important Hilarima inscription, which was found in 2001, which is one of the only known long Karian inscription. L'aumônier found a piece, we found the other piece recently, but except from this, which is an official text because it's selling priesthood, but not so official. It's not a decree or whatever. This is the only official Karian text that we know of, as far as I'm not a philologist, but as far as I recall. So yes, when they wanted the inscription to stay for long, they did it on marble, and I believe that the Greek taught them that. Or they took it from the Greek, in one way or the other, unfortunately.
So there is a big difference between text and iconography.
Yeah, definitely. But that wouldn't disturb them. You know, I mean, take the coinage of Mausolus. On one side, you've got Zeus Labraundus, and on the other side, two different mint, two different coins, same period. You've got Apuro, and the other one is the archer king. So it's a real Greek figure, and on the other coin, which was minted by the same people at the same period, it is the real Persian king. It wouldn't disturb them at all. They would have integrity. Anne-Marie Carstens recently spoke about creolization, which is, I think, a very interesting approach. Creolization, make new with old stuff. Reuse, reinterpret, digest it, and then give it back as your own. That's I think, an interesting approach. So they would switch from one to another. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Any more questions about this very interesting theme about Karians?
Next time you invite me, I speak about the tomb.
Yes, so
but that would
we will find a
take 2
date
hours.
for this. We will find a date and have a good. Pas d'autres questions. Reste à nous remercier notre orateur pour cette vraiment très belle présentation. Merci beaucoup. Puis merci à vous d'être venus et d'avoir posé toutes ces questions. Bonne soirée.